is the Pro America Report with Ed Martin.
Welcome back. Ed Martin here, and we are on The Answer San Diego, and my friend Mark Mix has been in the mix. There you go, Mark. I'm sure I'm not the first person to do that. He's the president of the National Right to Work Committee and has been in the mix, has been in the fight for decades. He's also the president, by the way, of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. I'll put both of those up on social media. You know, Mark, as I was preparing, I was talking to Andrea Kaye, one of our hosts. I don't know if you've been on her show before, but about the fact that we're up against President Biden in the State of the Union. Thankfully, most of our listeners wouldn't be bothered. But I want to ask you about this, about the question of workers and about where we are as an economy and as a culture of, business and entrepreneurship and all. Under Joe Biden, is this, I hate to say it like this is a bit of a setup, is it as bad as it seems? I mean, everything the unions want, it feels like Biden does.
Well, that's right, Ed. And everything that the unions want is the ability to take more rights away from individual workers. And it's not surprising when you follow the narrative of this president. I mean, and the State of the Union address, for those that want to jump over there real quick, I don't recommend it. Let's stay here. Stay here with Ed.
Stay here.
That's right. Stay here with Ed. But he's going to talk about, union this and union that. And really, when you decipher what he says, and it's not hard to decipher, Ed, he's talking about more power for union officials to force more workers under union monopoly bargaining and representation, because that's really what he's talking about. When he talks about, the union this and union that, he's talking about union power. And, when you think about it in context, only 6% of the private sector workforce is unionized today in America. And wow. So he's basically kowtowing to a very small minority, even smaller because he's kowtowing to union officials, let alone rank and file workers, but he's ignoring the path and the problems of the 94% of the workers out there that labor without union representation, and they get paid and they get vacations and they get benefits. And the notion that everyone has to be unionized is ridiculous, but that's what he's saying if you tune over in there, but I don't recommend it again. But that's probably what he's saying today.
Yeah, we're talking with Mark Mix, by the way. Again, he almost 20 years ago this year, Mark became the president of both the committee and the foundation, National Right to Work, as a movement that's really as Mark has described it, it's about empowering the workers against what I think was the small c corruption, sometimes big C corruption of union officials over time, right? And there's a history you can write about how when unions started 120 years ago, many of them were trying to protect people. At a certain point, the system flipped, and I think that's what Mark addresses really well, and all across the country, especially you'll see him over in Fox and Friends and other places. Mark, I got something forwarded to me of yours, referring to, hey, look. If you had a freedom of speech in this country or the Second Amendment, and you were only allowed to use it like an hour a day is the one on freedom of speech. And I think people feel that even more differently. The second example, Second Amendment, if someone said, you're right to keep and bear arms, but only on the weekend, right? But freedom of speech, I think people feel that one more palpably now. And your point was workers have lost their freedom and are losing it. Let me push back for a second and say, is that a constitutional right? Is that what the Janus decision? Does that make it clear that that's what we're dealing with? And I think you should walk us through that for our listeners to understand how that's a constitutional protection, not just a good idea, not just a good policy.
Yeah, absolutely, Ed. And thanks for you understand it exactly. But let me explain what happened and what the Janus decision is about and what this violation of free speech is coming down to. And this Biden administration, once again, saying that we recognize your free speech rights, but they only exist for 24 hours out of every year. And I'll start with the general and get down to the specifics about what's happening and what the Biden administration is trying to do.
Right.
Unfortunately, in this country, Ed, as you mentioned, going back to the 1930s and even before, union officials have striven for the ability to control workers and force them into these collectives where they become the exclusive monopoly bargaining agent for all workers in a unionized situation, meaning that if you're an individual you can't speak up. You can't talk to your employer. The employer can't talk to you. You have to go through a union official in order to communicate about terms and conditions of employment where you work. And so this monopoly power is unique. It really is. I mean, there's no other place where we can go in statutory law except labor policy where you can create an agency over me, Ed, without my agreement, without a meeting of the minds, without consideration, without duress, and without the legality of it being proven. Those are the elements of a contract. Yet in labor policy, we give union officials the power to set up a kind of a new agency relationship saying, well, Ed, you didn't vote for me. You didn't want me. You didn't ask for me. But because of your brothers and sisters voted for me by one vote more than your side voted, I now speak for you and you can't speak for yourself. Obviously, we've argued over the years in what have been a series of Supreme Court cases and Supreme Court arguments going back to the 1970s, that that's a violation of your freedom of speech and further a violation of your freedom of association. Well, in 2018, we finally got to the Supreme Court with a case that had nothing left in the refrigerator, if you will. And I liken this to going to a delicatessen and asking for a quarter pound of roast beef. And they reach in there and grab that big hunk of roast beef and they slice off some, they give it to you. And then you come back the next week and the next week and you do it because you like roast beef. Well, at some point, they reach into that cooler and there's nothing left. And when the Supreme Court got the Janus decision in 2018, there was nothing left but the First Amendment when it came to compulsory forced payment of fees to government entities for the privilege to work for your government. And so the Supreme Court in a majority decision said these workers, government workers, have a First Amendment right to opt out of any forced payment of fees to unions because everything that unions do in the public sector is politics. They're redressing government. They're trying to convince government how to spend resources, how to raise resources, and how to basically run the government. And so the Supreme Court said, you know, we've got First Amendment constitutional protections. Right. Well, when they said that, it started a 4-year ongoing odyssey that we've been in since that time, defending those rights against workers. And now we have the Biden administration using the Federal Labor Relations Authority to say, oh, yeah, we recognize that you have a constitutional right, but that right will only exist for 24 hours every year. And if you miss it, you're forced to compel speech for the next 364 days.
Yeah, that's, I think, Mark, you explained it well. And I think it's important for people to realize the power of the federal government, these regulatory agencies. They come up with something like that. And they say, hey, of course, it's constitutional right. We're just going to limit it in time. And it's going to be limited because of these criteria. And they make up the criteria and they make them sound good. And then you worker, normal person, have to sue to protect yourself. Now you got to get a lawyer. Everybody hates lawyers. They're expensive. You got to do this, that, and the other thing. And it's a real burden. And the trick of the massive state is to sort of outlast you and to outweight you and to outspend you. It's kind of like when big tech swamps these smaller inventors, because the inventors, I come up with one patent. Well, Google's got 1,000 lawyers on salary that are going to beat me down on my patent. And I'm going to have to be spending my life savings and burning through my retirement. And in your case, the government, when it's Biden and they're putting the thumb on the scale, you basically have to litigate all the way back through, which, by the way, it argues well for your work and for the importance of the idea of having both the National Right to Work Committee as well as the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. But it's a burden. And so let me ask you, what's the ideal solution? I mean, you're always going to end up with a Democrat, unfortunately, winning president sometime, back and forth. Is there a way that this could go up and be clearer? Are you hoping for a better case where the courts say, no, that's not how it works?
Yeah, I think so, Ed. And I think there's debate about that ongoing right now. And it's been ongoing for a while, but it seems like it's gathered some new energy. And Ed, you probably have talked about this before, but it's called the Chevron doctrine.
Right.
And the idea is that, the legislature passes something. They pass a statutory law. Right. It becomes into effect. And then it goes to the agencies for kind of putting meat on the bone, if you will. And the idea of interpreting what the statute means as it occurs every day in commerce or whatever. And so that EPA versus West Virginia case had brought this to the attention. Well, there's been other cases that have been up and talked about, but the West Virginia EPA case was one where the court said, you know what, we may have to take a deeper look at this idea of what the agencies do and kind of the license that they've claimed once a statute is passed and they perform these regulatory, interpretations. And there's no place where it's happened more than that under the National Labor Relations Act, where the National Labor Relations Board, through precedent or through rulemaking or through just their interpretation of the law, where the NLRA has been basically swollen to a point where the rights that were originally intended for workers, the right to refrain from unionization that's written into the preamble of the National Labor Relations Act, has been so decimated and so larded up with barnacles that are, non-statutory, that there has to be something done about the agency creep that comes with, all of these independent agencies and those that are making new precedent. So I think that's kind of a tangent off of the labor policy that we operate on, but we're sensitive to that notion because everything we do, to your point, Ed, and you made it very well, these workers are up against a battery of lawyers, whether it be by the government or by the organized labor officials. And we're fighting over what? Maybe, and I know it's not immaterial, but $1,000 a year.
Right,
and to your point, when you go find an attorney and he says, well, I'm going to need a $5,000 retainer to represent you.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, there's not a lot of, I mean, principle is nice and all, but you got to pay the bills. And they, and I think we're talking with Mark Mix again, and I will put up on social media links to his websites and what they're doing. But this is one of the problems. I keep telling my listeners are tired of hearing about it. But I maybe they are. I've been listening to a book on tape on Grover Cleveland. And when he was out of office, he came back into office. He's the one president that was thrown out of office and then came back again to win a second term. And one of the things that I fascinated with him is he lost because of the tariff issue, but he really lost because the workers, the country decided that he wasn't supporting the workers. I mean that he was not paying attention to the workers. But back then, the budget was like $50 million. No kidding. Something crazy like that. Like there was no power in Washington. Why? Because there hadn't been an income tax. There's no federal income tax until the early 1900s. So he didn't have a lot of tools to build up the arsenal. Now you go to Washington, there's building after building. That's a cliche. That's the building after building isn't what's important. There's bureaucrat after bureaucrat who can make your life costly and delayed and make your business spend 6 months fighting through red tape. At a certain point, you wonder if it's reversible.
Yeah, and, it's interesting when you look at the stats of just the number of lobbyists in Washington D.C. And this is a real manifestation of what you're talking about. I think I looked at this one time, and during the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, there was something like 5,000 lobbyists in Washington D.C. registered. At the end of his 8 years, there were 35,000. Wow. Now, what does that tell you about the power of government and how it grows? Right. And I suspect the number is even greater today because government's involved. The federal government, and let's get this correct, the federal government has gone way outside the fence posts that were originally established for them under the specifically enumerated powers that they would have. And, one of the problems that we deal with every day is this expansion of labor policy. When you go back, and you made the point earlier about unions and going back to, 120 years ago, and you are right. When you go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, Samuel Gompers, the father of the American labor movement, the gentleman that, the textbooks refer to as the leader of the worker movements back at the turn of the century then, was all in favor of voluntarism. He said that the workers of America adhere to voluntary institutions because anything that is forced together through compulsion is inherently weaker than anything brought together through voluntarism. And that makes perfect sense. And yet, now we have a union, officialdom that is so reliant on government power, and basically all of their power comes from government decrees, that they've got to spend billions politically every 2 years, Ed. Right. And this is no surprise to anybody. And the reason is because government gotten so doggone big. Yeah. And that just kind of rolls back and spills back to the Chevron doctrine and the precedents and the NLRB and cases like this where the Federal Labor Relations Authority is going to tell you that your constitutional rights only exist for 24 hours.
Yeah. Well, Mark, it's a very helpful service. I've told you before, Mark Mix is the president of the National Right to Work Committee and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and especially in terms of, I know you're in the fight for your members and for lots of folks, but it's also just educating all of us on this. I think it's we have to get a mindset that includes a sort of the practical return of power. Let's give power back to the states. Well, that sounds good, but it's easy that's easy to outlast if you're a politician or elected official. Very specific opportunities to say, roll this back so that there's more clarity on things is really important. So thanks for taking the time. Mark Mix, everybody. And I didn't even get into, I'm sorry, our show originates out in San Diego. I was going to get into some of the question of the jobs numbers and what it really means for workers as opposed to how they're playing games and what this influx of millions and millions of illegal immigrants is doing. But we don't have time. So we'll have you back again. Mark Mix, everybody. Thank you, Mark. We'll be in touch and we'll put it all up on social media. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right.